This is The Jungle. Perhaps you've heard of it before. This book was one of the most influential of its time. Its effect on the American people was like no other, but not because of its story, instead because of its truths. The Jungle was a book depicting the lack of rights for immigrant workers in the meat industry in the early 1900s. Although its purpose was misinterpreted upon publication, it led to the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, which greatly increased the safety of meatpacking plants in the early 1900s. The author of The Jungle, Upton Beale Sinclair, was born in Baltimore, Maryland, September 20th, 1887. He grew up in a poor family. His father was an alcoholic and wasted all their money, so Sinclair had to help support them at a young age, and did so through his writing. He began in his teens writing boys' adventure stories for fun. He had a piece of his work featured in a national magazine at the age of 14. By the time he was 17, he owned his own apartment and could continue to support his family. Sinclair was able to pay for his college on his own, and in 1901 he published his first book, Springtime and Harvest. The book was a minor success, allowing him to continue writing, but it was only a fraction of what was to come. In 1904, Sinclair heard of the Chicago Stockyard Strike. The Chicago Stockyard Strike was an attempted push by employees against the meatpacking companies in order to get better working conditions. But when the workers attempted to rally together, everything fell apart. The different ethnic groups wouldn't mix together. To make it even worse, the companies hired African American men as strikebreakers. The strikes ended quickly. After reading about it, Sinclair became fascinated with the immigrants in these stockyards. He began researching the meatpacking plants and uncovered a large amount of turmoil surrounding them. He decided he wanted to write a book based around the immigrants working at these plants. The idea for The Jungle was born. Sinclair was given some financial support by the Appeal to Reason, a small newspaper in Kansas, and he set out for Chicago. In the stockyards, Sinclair didn't need much to sneak around. As long as he dressed shabby and had a few well-thought-out lies, he could go anywhere he wanted. Sinclair wandered the stockyards every day for 2 months. The things he saw were appalling. Foreigners would come to America with absolutely nothing and were desperate for work. Entire families had to work in order to stay alive. All the women and children were out working every day, earning wages that weren't even enough to support one person, much less an entire family. People would rummage in dumps for any scrap of food they could get their hands on. They would take any money they could get. Sinclair wrote about an elderly man who took a job under the conditions that he would give a certain portion of his wages to his boss. Women were sexually abused in the plants. Prostitution rings were run out of a few, and some women were forced to sleep with their employers in order to keep their job. Votes were bought among the immigrants. Wealthy politicians knew they were desperate, so they would promise a set amount of money as long as the immigrants voted the way they were told. The Chicago stockyards were disgusting. The air reeked of animal excrement and rotten flesh. In the packing plants, calf fetuses and diseased animals were included in with the good meat. Any bad meat would be doctored and sprinkled in with the rest while being packaged. Guts and extra pieces on the ground would be swept up along with anything else on the floor and sold as potted meat in stores. The meat inspectors were bribed and turned a blind eye to everything that was going on. The working conditions in the plants were on par with that of an outhouse. There were exposed blades all around the plants. Whenever a worker was even scraped, he was almost guaranteed blood poisoning. It was said that some workers had actually fallen into meat grinders and were mixed in with the meat. The factories were never heated in the winter, and employees would almost freeze to death. Due to a lack of protection, the laborers in the pickling plants would have their hands eaten off by the acids they worked with. After his time in Chicago, Sinclair returned home and immediately began writing. He worked on The Jungle for 3 months, and Sinclair wrote with a greater passion than ever before, because he had been there to witness the horrifying events. When he completed the book, he began looking for publishers. Several companies turned him down, calling the book too political, but after asking a few more people, he finally found Doubleday. They went straight to work, and by the February of 1906, the book was released. It became an instant bestseller. Americans nationwide read about the horrors inside. They read about the immigrants and how mistreated they were. They learned how horrifying it was in the plants and about the disease lurking around every bend. But instead of focusing on the immigrants and learning how they were abused, the public focused on the few chapters that described how their food was handled. They were disgusted by the lack of sanitation in the plants and were horrified to learn of all the bits and pieces of human, calf fetuses, and rotten flesh that was included in whatever they were eating. The fame of the jungle spread so far that eventually it reached the White House, and President Roosevelt read an advanced copy of the book. He sent some of his agents to Chicago to investigate the situation, and they came back reporting that it was much worse than described in the jungle. Roosevelt invited Sinclair to the White House to hear his ideas for improving the meat industry, and a few months later, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act were passed. These acts were designed to keep the food as clean as it could be. The Pure Food and Drug Act required certain drugs to be labeled with correct ingredients and proper dosage. It established laws that prevented the sale of adulterated food that had been contaminated with poison or that had been infected. The Meat Inspection Act included the same things, but added on laws requiring the meatpacking plants to maintain a certain sanitation standard. There were laws in place before these acts, but they weren't enforced. The only reason they were created was so England would continue trade with America. These new acts were enforced much more than any that had come before it. After the acts were passed, the hype around the jungle began to die down. The packing plants were cleaner than before, and Americans felt a little safer purchasing meat. But Sinclair was still unsatisfied. He wished the rights of immigrants would have been improved in some way. There were no minimum wages and no laws protecting the laborers, so the owners of these large companies had free reign over the immigrants. The jungle was completely based around an immigrant family and their struggles, but the public was more interested in what they were eating instead of the people who made it. Sinclair put it best himself. I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit it in the stomach. Even nowadays, the meatpacking industry isn't perfect. Meat companies continue to take advantage of immigrants. Countless articles and documentaries have been created around the subject. In the documentary Food, Inc., it is clearly shown how there is still a great lack of sanitation, and there are still many problems with immigrants in the meat industry. The meat industry has become so large, it's almost impossible to control the sanitation of such a huge amount of meat. There are immigration problems in America, period. But some meat companies will bring foreigners to America and have them work at their plants. But if the immigrants are found by authorities, the companies do nothing to protect the immigrants they brought into America. The companies aren't held accountable for their actions. Many things have been improved since Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Sanitation has increased in plants, and workers are treated much better than before. But new problems have arisen in the industrial part of America. So the question remains, who will be the next Upton Sinclair?